All right, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. My name is James Cantu, and I will be your moderator today, hosting our event, our Sheba webinar today, Vaping on Campus, What the Research Says on Emissions and Potential Health Impacts. I would like to welcome Christy Bell Huff. Christy Bell Huff is a research manager at Chemical Insights Research Institute of UL Research Institutes. She manages and tracks strategic research initiatives and develops internal and external technical documents and summaries of findings. Christy previously served as a lecturer and the director of faculty and student training in the Wallace H. Coulter Department of Biomedical Engineering at Georgia Institute of Technology. She has also been an engineering faculty member at Lawrence Technical University in Southfield, Michigan. She holds a PhD and MS in chemical engineering from Purdue University, an MA in education from the University of Michigan, and a BS in chemical engineering from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Chemical Insights Research Institute, or CIRI, of UL Research Institute, is a nonprofit organization dedicated to scientific research, publication, education, and communication on environmental exposures resulting from technologies and practices, their health impact on human health, and processes for reducing health risks. CIRI provides actionable data and resources to help manufacturers, educators, healthcare providers, and consumers make informed environmental decisions and risk reduction strategies for the protection of human health. And with that, I would love to hand it off to Christy Bell Huff. Thank you very much. And Christy, I'm sorry, you are muted.
Well, we had to do that initially just to get that out of the way. So there you go. Thank you, James, very much. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera so that that's not distracting. And let me get my slides going here and we'll get started. Thank you so much for having us. All right. Let's see. All right, James, you're seeing my slides?
That is correct. And if I can add, we will take comments and questions in, or if you would place questions in the chat and we will field them towards the end. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so well, this is our Chemical Insights Love Shima slide. And welcome everyone. Okay. All right, we got this going here. Welcome everyone to Vaping on Campus, what the research says on emissions and potential health impacts. And really, thank you so much for having us here. We at CIRI really enjoy having the opportunity to, share our research and what we're finding really whenever we get the chance. And as James said, I'm Christy from CIRI, and I do a lot of things at CIRI related to research and education efforts, but one of my favorite things, no joke, has been working with Shima. I just think you're really a great organization. I've really enjoyed getting to know many of you and the organization as a whole. So again, just really appreciate your partnership and thank you for having us. So before we dive into our vaping topic, let me give you a little background on CIRI. James had mentioned that we are part of UL Research Institutes, and at Chemical Insights Research Institute, we're dedicated to scientific research, publication, education, and communication on environmental exposures that typically result from technologies and practices, or sometimes from recent phenomena like wildfires. And so we characterize those exposures, and then we look at their impacts on human health, and we look at ways for reducing the risks. And at CIRI, we have some scientific technology that allows us to study real life health risks. And so this includes our unique exposure chambers, and these were designed and built at CIRI. And these chambers allow us to measure emissions that come off of a product. So like a 3D printer or an e-cigarette, we can measure the emissions from the product while it's in use. And we can measure those emissions very precisely down to the parts per billion level. And then we can look at the human health risks. And so we can also alter the settings in the environmental chamber to look at factors like ventilation and temperature. And then we can use that data that we collect to create human exposure models. And we're also starting to use some cutting edge technologies to help us look at a different way of doing human risk assessment from chemical exposure. So we have a new state-of-the-art toxicology lab, and we're now starting to use direct in vitro tools that allow us to biologically evaluate a chemical or a chemical mixture's impact on human health. And we're going to show you some of those kinds of results today. And at CIRI, we have research initiatives that span a number of topics. For example, 3D printing emissions. I think many of you might be aware of our work in that area. But we also look at flame retardants and furniture flammability. We look at air cleaning effectiveness. We're studying global air pollution and asthma. We're looking at the impacts of weather on material emissions. We're studying textiles as a source of PFAS exposure. Of course, we're looking at e-cigarettes and vaping emissions. We are investigating risks of wildfires and their impacts on the wildland-urban interface. And we're doing a lot of research in the area of new toxicology tools. So really, all of our research asks the questions, what are the chemicals and particles of concern? What does human exposure to these look like, or how does it occur? What are the risks to human health? We have a particular focus on vulnerable populations. And then what are the mitigation strategies that can reduce the risks? And so today we'll, of course, be talking about our e-cigarettes and vaping initiative. And these are the objectives for our session today. You may have read those when you read the session description. I'll just give you a second here, take those in. And this is how we'll achieve those objectives. We're going to start by reviewing the basics of e-cigarettes, including the relevance of the topic on college campuses. Now you're going to hear me calling these ENDS, ENDS. That stands for Electronic Nicotine Delivery Systems. So just an acronym that we use. So ENDS or e-cigarettes or vapes is what we're talking about. We're going to take a deep dive into CIRI's research on the topic, and we'll start with the aims and methodology. We'll look at some of our results and the potential health impacts that they indicate. And then we'll review mitigation strategies on campuses and end by looking forward to next steps. So fair warning, I have a lot of content. We're going to move along at a pretty quick pace. And I think James will be monitoring the chat for questions. So if you think of something, feel free to put it in there, but we're just going to keep moving along here. Okay, so let's start by reviewing the basics of e-cigarettes, also known as ENDS, also known as vapes. So ENDS are battery-powered devices that convert a liquid into a vapor and the user inhales. So that's called vaping. And these ENDS liquids, or these e-liquids, as they're called, typically contain various formulations of nicotine, glycerol, propylene glycol, pH modifiers, and other kinds of flavoring agents. And it's really these flavoring agents that have enticed the younger populations into using these devices. So these devices were originally meant to be used as smoking cessation tools, but that's really not the case anymore. We commonly now see individuals who had never used tobacco products, they're now starting to use ENDS. And these flavorings, they come in literally anything you can think of. Menthol, cotton candy, kiwi strawberry, mango berry, Skittles flavors. If you can think of it, it's probably an e-liquid flavor out there somewhere. And this is part of what's enticed some of the younger generation to start using ENDS. So despite the rapid evolution and really the wide variety of ENDS products that are out there, the basic operation of the devices has remained the same. Typically, when a user inhales from the device, the airflow is then detected by a sensor, and the sensor contains a microprocessor that activates a heating element, or the atomizer. And so the atomizer then is what heats and vaporizes the e-liquid that's stored in the cartridge, and that vapor is what the user inhales. And so the vaporized e-liquid then cools down and condenses and forms a cloud of e-liquid aerosols. Now, the cartridge also contains the mouthpiece for the device, and in some models, there's no sensor present, so the atomizer can be activated by pushing a button. Some models also feature an LED that's triggered when the user inhales, and that kind of mimics the glow of burning tobacco in a traditional cigarette. So the types of ENDS products differ, but they differ primarily in their appearance. They can differ in the nature of the e-liquid solution that they use. They can differ in the capacity of the cartridge that contains the e-liquid, and that's sometimes called the tank. They can differ in the nature of the heating element and the size and the type of the battery. And they really have evolved rapidly. As usage has grown, the market has changed, new products have been developed, but it's currently estimated that there are over 460 ENDS brands out there and more than 7,700 flavors available on the internet. And in our work, we focused on several ENDS device formats. We looked at tanks or mods, as they're called, and these devices are rechargeable, they're reusable, and they're highly modifiable, and that's so that the user can enhance or customize the vaping experience. We also looked at pod mods, and these are also highly popular, and that's due in part to the fact that they use nicotine salts. This format uses nicotine salts, and these salts have lower pH, and that allows for higher levels of nicotine to be inhaled with less irritation, and that's apparently viewed as a good thing. So we also looked at disposable pods. Now, these are one of the most popular formats that currently are trending. They're non-reusable, non-refillable, although some recent models allow you to recharge the device for longer use. But these are the formats that we looked at. And I'll give you a little bit of history here. When ENDS products first appeared on the market in the 1990s and the early 2000s, many viewed them as potential aids for smoking cessation. And some studies did show that using e-cigarettes with nicotine can help smokers stop smoking when compared to the use of placebo e-cigarettes. However, more recent studies are showing that adult smokers who try ENDS for the purpose of stopping smoking, most ultimately do not stop using traditional cigarettes. Rather, they continue to use both products. So among adult e-cigarette users aged 45 years and older, about 30% were either current or former regular cigarette smokers. Only 11% had never been cigarette smokers. If we contrast that, among e-cigarette users aged 18 to 24, so the college age, demographic, 40% of those users had never been traditional cigarette smokers. So there's really been a shift there. And usage of ENDS has increased dramatically in the US in the last decade, particularly among adolescents and young adults. So in 2018, ENDS were the most used tobacco product among youth, representing more than 3.6 million US middle and high school students. They reported using e-cigarettes in the past 30 days. That represents about 5% of US middle schoolers, about 21% of US high schoolers. And if we compare that in 2018, only about 2.8% of US adults reported being current ENDS users. And that really has led to the US Surgeon General has declared e-cigarette use among youth and young adults a public health concern. Both the American Lung Association and the Food and Drug Administration agree that e-cigarette use among young people has really reached epidemic levels. And, given that the product safety of ENDS has kind of lagged behind the rapidly growing market, there's still a lot to learn about the effects of ENDS use on human health. And just a couple more important points here. Like, there are no federal guidelines to ensure the relative safety of ENDS that might influence their manufacture or their production. There's no federal guidelines to ensure that manufacturers provide adequate user information. So regarding the maintenance or the care of the device, or even the e-liquids that they're using. So there aren't really federal guidelines related to that. So while there is a lot to learn, we have studied ENDS emissions, and others have too. Our work and the work of others has found a complex mixture of chemicals in ENDS emissions, and we've identified chemicals of concern like industrial chemicals, pesticides, and flavorings that are linked to possible toxic effects and respiratory irritation. Now, the aerosols that ENDS users are breathing in and non-users are exposed to secondhand, they also can contain metal contaminants. Those are derived from the components of the heating element. They can also contain numerous volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, and even ultrafine particles. So it's actually often difficult for the consumer to know exactly what chemicals are in the products that they're using, because there have been some studies. For example, an e-cigarette marketed as containing no nicotine was found to contain nicotine when it was analyzed. And that's concerning because nicotine is a highly addictive substance. It's toxic to a developing fetus. It can harm brain development. And we know brain development continues past the teen years into the mid-20s. So certainly some things to think about when it comes to ends there. Now, relating this to college campuses, in 2022, e-cigarette sales reached an all-time high. 324.7 million units were sold. 20% of all youth were using e-cigarettes. That's a 135% increase over just 2 years. And on college campuses, nearly 16% of college students reported using e-cigarettes in the last 3 months. Now, based on their popularity, there are also some misconceptions around the safety of ends. So the ends process, it does not involve combustion. The devices don't produce any kind of ash or fire or smoky smell. So those features often lead to the perception that ends are a safe alternative to cigarettes or other traditional tobacco products. But while the ends emissions may contain lower concentrations of certain toxic or carcinogenic compounds, when you're comparing them to tobacco cigarettes, ends aerosols are not harmless as some people claim. What we already know is that the use of ends can increase the risk of heart disease, the risk of a myriad of lung disorders and lung damage, high blood sugar or prediabetes, and has also been shown to negatively impact oral health. Let's kind of look specifically at oral and lung health risks that are associated with vaping. So current evidence indicates that the e-liquids and the ends aerosol constituents are oral health hazards, and they may increase periodontal disease risks. So there's some data showing that the vegetable glycerin, which is part of that e-liquid formulation, that elicits a 4-fold increase in microbial adhesion to tooth enamel. It elicits a 2-fold increase in biofilm formation, and that leads to pathogenic bacterial invasion and eventually tooth decay. There are similar studies that have shown decreases in enamel and tooth hardness. Vaping also has negative implications on oral health perception. 11.4% of ends users self-report cracked or broken teeth, and 18.5% report gingival pain and or bleeding. And with regard to the lungs, e-cigarette or vaping associated lung injury, or EVALI, it has been reported, of course, but by the end of 2019, more than 2,500 EVALI cases had been reported, and those were from all 50 states, and 55 deaths had been reported. Now, alongside EVALI, we see increased risk of wheezing, inflammation, impaired pulmonary function, and even lung cell alterations. And these findings, among some of the other work that's been done, really suggest the possibility that ends use may be adding to the overall prevalence of oral health and respiratory disorders. All right, so as I mentioned, product safety testing for ends really lags behind their increasing market share, and we don't know a lot about the complex mixture of particles and chemicals that result from ends use. So we recognized this gap in research knowledge, and we set out to develop analytical measurement technologies for determining human exposure risks to particles and chemicals that result from ends use. So what does that mean? Well, we set out to do some research, and we had the following research questions. How can we systematically measure, identify, and characterize these emissions? What types of emissions does vaping generate, and what factors impact those? What impact might ends product design have on the emissions? And what impact does exposure to the emissions have on human health? And what we needed first was a way to generate some vaping emissions. We didn't feel right about asking the researchers to just start vaping in the lab, right? So we had to initially focus on the development of a mechanical puff generator, and that allows us to simulate realistic puffing topography. So we could simulate real life vaping. And we needed that so we could study emissions in our exposure chambers. So along with one of our university partners, we designed and built a way to create, capture, and measure ENS emissions. And we call this our ENS Aerosol Generation System, EAGS. And the aerosol generation system simulates a person using an ENS device, and it has the capability of accommodating various types of devices. And we can also adjust the atomizer settings when we're doing our testing. So we could now simulate vaping scenarios in our exposure chambers. So then we could characterize those emissions. Here's kind of a full view of the setup. We place the aerosol generator into our exposure chamber and we let it vape. So it generated emissions that would enter the exposure chamber, and that would allow for sample collection and analysis. That kind of represents like secondhand exposure. But we have additional condensation lines attached to the EAGS, the outlet there, so that we can collect samples and analyze those that represent inhaled exposure. So once we've collected all of the samples, we can then characterize those in our analytical lab. So what did we test? Well, we tested both pod and mod, or those tank devices, inside the exposure chamber. We tested devices at multiple age states, and I'll describe that here in a little bit: new, broken in, and aged. And we could control the air exchange rate in the chambers, so that let us look at the impacts of ventilation. We looked at different power settings and battery charges. We also looked at different e-liquids. All right, so once we had a way to simulate vaping realistically, we could sample the emissions in the exposure chambers and we could start to characterize those. Now, I want to, as I mentioned earlier, we tested ENS devices at different age states because we did want to know, like, what is the impact of device age on these emission profiles? So we looked at these new and broken in and aged states. And in the vaping research, the term puff fraction is used to refer to the age of the device. So you can see here kind of what we mean by new, broken in, and aged. For the tank devices, the new state corresponded to puffs 1 to 25. The broken in state was set at puffs 101 to 125, and the age state was established as puffs 201 to 225. And we decided those ranges after looking at online user reviews and social media posts kind of related to tank devices. We determined that the coils, that's kind of the replaceable part that contains the heating element and the wick, those rarely are used longer than this by most tank users. So that's how we set those ranges. Now for the pod devices, the new state corresponded to puffs 1 to 50, and the age state was set at puffs 101 to 150. And we know that in practice, pods rarely last much longer than 150 puffs, and so we really only tested 2 states for those devices. All right, so our samples were collected using our ENS aerosol generation system, and those represented inhaled emissions during vaping, and then we could characterize those. We characterized aerosol particle size using scanning mobility particle sizers. We characterized VOCs. We used gas chromatography mass spectrometry for that, and we characterized metals. We used inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry for the metals. And so the remaining emissions then are vented into the exposure chamber, and we can sample and characterize those in similar ways as well. And that represents secondhand exposure. All right, so in addition to characterizing the emissions, we also were interested in the toxicity and the potential human health impacts of vaping. So once we had captured the emissions, we could then assess their toxicity by exposing primary small airway epithelial cells to the emissions. So the extracted emissions were dispersed in media, and they were applied to the cells in a submerged culture format. And we exposed the cells for 24 hours and for 7-day time periods. We could then analyze the cells for specific biomarkers or indicators of disease, and those included oxidative stress, cellular viability, and DNA damage. Now, I know some of you may be, but I don't think all of us in the audience are hardcore toxicologists, myself included. So I just wanted to briefly talk about what markers of toxicity we were looking for and kind of what those were. So oxidative stress, that's one of the cellular effects that could be caused by ENS aerosol inhalation. And you can see kind of from the picture, the normal healthy cell is normally balanced with antioxidants, and that's our body's defense mechanism. So when the cells are attacked by free radicals, which are those unstable molecules that damage our cells, that disrupts the cellular processes, including aerobic respiration. So then the level of antioxidants goes down. And when that happens, we see what's called oxidative stress. So that's one thing we were looking for. Another potential cellular effect included inflammation and cytotoxicity. That means cell death. There are several current studies out there that show ENS aerosols do trigger inflammatory responses. And that happens because the inhalation of the ENS aerosol increases the inflammatory cytokines in the epithelial cells. And the inflammation of the cells can result in cell cycle dysfunction and even cell death. And the presence of pro-inflammatory cytokines can cause acute inflammation and can lead to respiratory distress syndrome, asthma, and even COPD. So we were also looking at that. And lastly, we were looking for whether ENS aerosol inhalation could lead to genotoxicity. And genotoxicity is the toxic response of cells that results in degradation of genetic material, so DNA and RNA. And that might be damage at the chromosomal level, but it could be at the gene level as well, which can cause mutations. So in particular, we might see repairment dysfunction with the DNA, or we might see fragmentation of the DNA, and both of those can lead to adverse health effects. So just to recap what we've done in these studies, here's a snapshot of the whole process. We used different ENS device types to generate emissions. We generated them in our emission chambers using our aerosol generation system. We captured those emissions and we measured and characterized them using various analytical techniques. And finally, we looked at the adverse health outcomes that those emissions could cause. All right, so let's look at the results. We'll start with aerosols, and aerosols refers to suspended particles in the surrounding gases. And I know most of you are familiar with terms like PM 2.5 and particulate matter. That would be considered aerosols in this context. So let's look at what factors impacted the aerosol emissions. So aerosol emissions were impacted by ENS device type, by e-liquid ingredient and flavorings, by the atomizer coil resistance and power, and by ventilation. Specifically regarding the ENS device type, in general, the pod type devices that we studied had higher particle emission factors than the mod type devices, or the tanks. With regard to e-liquid flavorings, we did see that there was an impact on particle emission factors, but there weren't really clear trends there. So definitely more research could be done to really determine that impact, but something was going on there. We did see impacts of the atomizer coil resistance and power. So for the same mod type device, atomizers with a smaller resistance had a higher emission factor. And so if we think about Ohm's law here, atomizers that had smaller resistance have a higher voltage. So then that would translate to a higher temperature in the device. Higher temperatures really ought to result in more e-liquid vaporization, and so more particles in the emissions. So definitely an effect there. And then chamber conditions like ventilation also had an impact. The unventilated scenario had 3 to 9 times higher particle emission factors for all the devices that we tested. So we also characterized the ENS aerosols over the lifetime of the different devices. And this chart provides the PM mass concentrations and the particle diameters, comparing the pods and the mods. And so in this assessment, we found that our mod and pod devices generated different levels of mass concentrations. You see that there in micrograms per meter cubed, with the pods being higher, right? But this was probably due to the differences in the particle sizes. The mod device generated much smaller particles than the pod device. And so in both devices, we did see a decline of particle concentration as the device aged. But these very small aerosols certainly are of particular concern. We know that their very small particles have the ability to penetrate deep into the body systems and cause harm. Particle emissions were also evaluated in an unventilated chamber, so 0 air changes per hour, and in a ventilated chamber with 3 air changes per hour. And the unventilated scenario had 3 to 9 times higher particle emission factors for the mod and the pod type devices. And I just think this is important to mention because there is a common misconception that vaping is safer than tobacco cigarettes. So vaping in these poorly ventilated spaces, I mean, might be happening more frequently than we think, right? And that could contribute to or even exacerbate in respiratory conditions for people in those spaces. So bottom line, ENDS usage generates high levels of aerosols or particulate matter, and the mean sizes of the particles could range from ultrafine, that's below 100 nanometers, up to 800 nanometers. And that's a major concern regarding exposure health impacts because we know that inhalation of ultrafine particulate matter is associated with respiratory and cardiovascular diseases and even premature death. So let's talk about VOCs. Overall, our data showed that the ENDS vapor can consist of more chemicals than what's listed in the ingredients. So some of these additional chemicals that we detected are linked to potential adverse health effects. And so we found 70 different VOCs to be associated with ENDS use. Many of the detected VOCs are irritants and carcinogens. In addition to nicotine, other known carcinogens like formaldehyde were emitted from both of the devices that we tested. We detected from both devices toluene. That's a reproductive toxin known to cause developmental defects. We detected siloxanes. Those have been linked to endocrine disruption and reproductive toxicity. We detected 1-butanol, which causes irritation to the eyes, skin, nose, and throat. It can also lead to dizziness and central nervous system depression. So we saw some concerning things in the ENDS emissions, and we also saw that VOC exposure increases with increased ENDS use. So, long-term human health risks likely to increase because of the presence of these VOCs. So specifically, we did observe that the age of the device does impact the VOC profile in the emissions, and these are the results for the pod devices. And now each puff fraction, remember that's the term for the device age, each puff fraction specifically has a unique VOC signature. It's actually VOCs and SVOCs, semi-volatile organic compounds, that we're measuring. But in puff fractions 1 through 50, now that represents a new device. We observed a total of 44 VOCs and SVOCs. 33 of those were unique, only found in that puff fraction. In the later puff fraction, we found 101 to 150, we found 60 total VOCs and SVOCs, and 49 of those were unique to the later puff fractions. Remember, that represents an older device. There were a total of 11 VOCs that were found in both of the puff fractions, both the new and the old devices. So you can see here the list of those, and formaldehyde is on that list. Also, there were a total of 16 VOCs that were found from the older device that presented specific health concerns. You can see the list here, and I put the chemicals in bold that you probably recognize as having particularly concerning health impacts. So things like benzene and xylene and toluene were found in the older puff fractions. And the presence of these VOCs certainly is concerning both for the user of the ENDS, but also for the bystanders, because exposure to VOCs can lead to acute and chronic health effects. These can include headache and irritation to the eyes, throat, and respiratory systems. Certain VOCs are linked to cancer and damage to organs in the central nervous system, certainly upon long-term exposure. All right, so aerosols, VOCs, and now let's talk about metals. We also characterized metals in the ENDS emissions. Several metals that are known to be hazardous were detected in the ENDS aerosols. You can see what we found here in this list. And the primary source of those heavy metals are the metallic components in the device. So like the filaments and the coils in the atomizer. And that's because those metallic components can degrade when they're in contact with oxidized acidic e-liquids. So as you can imagine, that's going to lead to additional metal exposure as the device ages. And increased metal exposure is a critical risk factor for various respiratory diseases. These include things like respiratory inflammation, asthma, COPD, and lung cancer. So to sum it up, ENDS emits high levels of particulate matter, especially ultrafine particles, emits volatile organic compounds and metals, and all of that represents the potential for adverse health effects. So let's look at these potential impacts in more detail. So what did we see when we exposed cells to these ENDS emissions? Remember, one thing that we were looking for was oxidative stress. And so one marker of oxidative stress was evaluated by the presence of reactive oxygen species, or ROS. So to measure the presence of ROS, we used a non-fluorescent dye that becomes fluorescent when it oxidizes. So when the cells contact with ROS, the dye shows more bright orange color. The presence of ROS leads to oxidative stress in the cells, so more bright orange color means more oxidative stress. So let's start with the result of the negative control here shows less orange compared to the treated cells, and the positive control. And that indicates that there is more oxidative stress in the treated cells. And we can see as the concentration gets higher, cells tend to cluster together, and that represents cell death. So if we compare the negative control after to the 24-hour exposure samples, we can see that there was an increase in oxidative stress as the device aged. In the 7-day exposure result, there was increased oxidative stress at the 0 to 25 puffs and at the 101 to 126 puff fractions. Now, the 201 to 226 puff fraction, it does show less orange color, and we're not actually sure why. We need to look at that more carefully. We suspect that could have been a technical error because overall, oxidative stress really does seem to increase as the device ages in general. All right, to measure the impact of the ENDS aerosols on cellular viability, we used a colorimetric assay that shows metabolic capacity of the cells. And so by observing the cell's metabolic capacity, we can measure the cell viability. And so summing up what we saw there was a significant decrease in cell viability. In the 24-hour exposure results, the older devices showed the most dramatic decrease in cell viability, but in the 7-day exposure, all of the treated groups showed that decrease in cell viability, with the older devices continuing to show more dramatic effects. Now, another marker of oxidative stress that we evaluated was the level of cellular glutathione. And glutathione is an antioxidant that's present in all mammalian cells, and it serves as a biomarker of oxidative stress. So a reduction in glutathione means the presence of oxidative stress. So we saw significant reduction in cellular glutathione after 24-hour exposures for the pod devices. And likewise for the pods, after 7 days of repeated exposure, there were significant reductions in cellular glutathione levels. Now the tanks were a little different. The tank devices did not elicit a reduction in glutathione at 24 hours, but there was a prominent reduction in glutathione observed after 7 days of exposure. So again, further indication of oxidative stress in the lung cells when exposed to vaping emissions. And lastly, the ENDS aerosol inhalation can also lead to genotoxicity. So remember, genotoxicity, that's the toxic response of the cells that results in the degradation of the genetic materials. So to look at that effect of ENDS aerosol exposure on DNA damage, we used the Comet chip assay. And that's an electrophoresis-based assay, and it quantifies the DNA damage level for each cell. It's actually very cool. So what we saw was a significant level of DNA damage observed from the aged devices after the 24-hour exposures. And in the 7-day exposure results, the treated groups showed increased levels of DNA damage. So specifically, we observed a 3-fold increase in DNA damage occurring at the later stages of the ENDS device aging process. So summing up what we've seen from our work, continuous use of the same ENDS device over extended periods of time causes moderate levels of toxicity and significant oxidative stress. We saw significant increases in DNA damage, particularly with older devices. So that really indicates that prolonged use could elicit genotoxicity, and that could cause pathological changes if it's not repaired. The toxicological outcomes based on device age might be related to the differences in the level and species of toxic VOCs that we found, because remember, each of the age states kind of had a unique VOC profile in the emissions. And certainly, these studies warrant further investigation into specific ENDS usage patterns, and you'll see some of that in our next steps, because that will help us determine any associated pathophysiological consequences. We also showed that usage parameters and device aging can impact respiratory health risks, and that might contribute usage also might contribute to additional exposure risks of aerosols and metals. And certainly we feel very proud of this work, and we've learned a lot, but there's still much to be done really to understand all of the potential health impacts of vaping. Certainly, we also need to think about what these results mean for those being exposed to emissions secondhand. So recent studies have shown that 70% of inhaled ENDS aerosols are subsequently exhaled. So that's certainly contributing to secondhand exposure. And these secondhand streams, they can present a risk to other people in the spaces. All right, so now that we know a lot more about the hazards of vaping, what can we do about it? I'm just going to briefly touch on mitigation strategies, because really the same kinds of strategies that you'd use to mitigate other types of air pollutants can apply here. And so first and foremost, we always think about source control. And in this case, that would mean stopping people from vaping, but I understand that's certainly easier said than done. So at the very least, I mean, encouraging people to go outside when they vape, or making sure that they're not standing near any air intakes, all of that can help. Cleaning is an important part of maintaining good indoor air quality, and that can help here too. So that means having a proactive protocol, having a routine cleaning program. You really want to avoid the buildup of settled dust and films, because that's another route of exposure. Occupant education and staff training, that's particularly important when it comes to vaping. There is a misconception that vaping doesn't have secondhand risks the way cigarettes do, but that's not true. So educating students and staff about this secondhand exposure, as well as the individual risks to vaping, right? But that can help reduce exposure on your campus. And finally, ventilation and filtration. That's one of the most important tools that we have to manage ENDS emissions. So let's look at that strategy in just a little bit more detail. And the best practices include making sure the HVAC system is diluting pollutants and removing or filtering the air. You want to be bringing in fresh filtered air of at least 15 to 20%. That's a good start. Another strategy is to have the highest rated air filter that the system allows, and you want to make sure that all the air is either expelled from the building or filtered before it's returning to the supply. Having a protocol for time-managed control systems is also good. You want that to begin 2 hours before and after most of the occupants are in the building. That can help improve the indoor air. Of course, a maintenance policy should have a protocol for routine maintenance and filter replacement on a schedule. Now, there are also additional air cleaning options. There's now technologies that integrate air cleaning into the HVAC system. There are also quite a few standalone air cleaners that could be used to supplement HVAC systems if needed. And standalone air cleaners are a great tool, but you do need to know what to look for. So you want to make sure that it has verified HEPA filtration. You can also incorporate activated charcoal filtration. That can help some with the VOCs, but that's kind of unpredictable. You definitely want to make sure that the unit does not introduce ozone. That would be an unintended consequence that could result. You want to make sure that the air cleaning unit is big enough to actually be effective too. In a given room, you want a clean air delivery rate that's rated for at least 2/3 of the room's area. All right, so I'm going to start to wrap it up here. What's next for us with this work. We have recently expanded our ENDS research with some NIH-funded work, and we're looking there at the early onset periodontal disease due to ENDS usage. And so expanding the research in this way is really going to help us define those links between ENDS usage patterns and changes in oral health. So that's kind of exciting. We also have a number of technical briefs and research summaries, as well as several journal articles that are available on our website on this topic. All of our resources are free of charge, so you're certainly welcome to go check those out. And stay tuned for upcoming press releases and news alerts and additional resources on the topic. Now, one thing I did want to mention is that we're preparing to develop a guidance document on vaping emissions and potential health impacts. And we're developing this with a task force that is made up of researchers, educators, healthcare professionals, and different stakeholders. And we wanted to say that if any of you are particularly interested in this topic or you have some particular expertise, we would really like to include a SHIMA member as part of the task force. So if that's something that you might be interested in participating in the task force and helping to create this guidance document, I guess you can reach out to me via email, or I can hang around here for a minute in the Zoom room and you can let me know. But we would love to include a SHIMA member on the task force if that's something that someone is interested in. Okay, so I kind of wanted to hear from you, just kind of what you're experiencing on your campuses with regard to vaping. What issues are you facing? What tools and resources might be helpful for you? We'd like to know those kinds of things. I guess we'll combine this. We'll also say that we'll open it for questions that might be in the chat. And then I'll stop sharing here in just 1 second and we can get to this. But also wanted to say I would love to keep in touch. You can find us on social media. You can certainly check out our website. We have a monthly newsletter. We'd love for you to join that as well. But definitely would like to stay in touch. So let's go back. And let's say that I'd just like to hear from you. Maybe type it into the chat. What issues are you facing on your campuses? What other resources would maybe be helpful for you? And I think I'll stop sharing now and we can see what we've got. Okay.
All right, so we're watching the chat. And I see, oh, something came in through Q&A. Hang on, that's a different path. Okay, 1 moment. So what are some ways that you could give your anti-smoking policies bite for those who don't comply?
Oh gosh. I'm not really sure how to answer that. Maybe we can collect some suggestions from other EHS people. Give your anti-smoking policies bite for those who don't comply. Any thoughts on that from the audience? I mean, I certainly, now you've seen the webinar, you're armed with some data. I mean, maybe that can help. You've got data that says that there are potential health impacts, not only for the user, but also for the bystander. And so thinking about that, I think would be important. James, did you type something? I can't tell here.
I tapped the button to answer it live.
Okay, yeah.
I'm trying to see, which is what I've not typed anything new. Oh, I hit done. Okay, there it goes away.
Okay.
Sorry,
So,
it's
go ahead.
technical.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think one way to expand this might be who does have an anti-smoking policy and how do you enforce it? I see another question. With the ever-changing look of vaping devices, what are some ways that you can keep up with recognizing the devices?
I mean, I guess the most obvious answer there would be just to kind of stay up with the trends. I mean, usually there's recognizing the vapor that's being emitted is certainly an indication. I mean, side story here, I had a student vaping in the back of the lecture hall when I was teaching at Georgia Tech. And so I could tell that it was happening because of the vapor that was being produced. But It's really hard to keep up with that. It's constantly changing, the market's constantly evolving, and the safety issues are lagging behind for sure. Are there resources that would be helpful on your campuses that maybe we could create? I mean, now you've seen some of the data that we have, you've seen some of the work that we're doing. Oh, I know this is more common in K-12, but thoughts on the vaping detectors? I mean, I think that could be a way that,
Matt, can you expand on that? What do you mean by vaping detectors? So if he's typing again, I know this is more common in K through 12, but thoughts on vaping detectors in
while he's typing,
yeah.
smoke detector-like devices. And probably maybe those are used quite often in the restrooms, because I think that's for K through 12, that's typically where the students are going. Um, we haven't looked into how accurate those are, so that's something we could think about, and maybe that would be helpful if we could add kind of some information around how effective those are. So I appreciate you bringing that up. There's someone here in one sentence, what could you say to a student vaping to discourage them using the data you presented, keeping it simple enough to explain? I mean, I would just say that there's data out there showing, long-term health effects, that you're damaging your DNA, you're damaging your lung cells. And if nothing, if you're not worried about yourself, worry about the other people that are around, perhaps.
Right. Any other questions or requests for resources?
Here's someone kind of suggesting some ways to give your policy bite, I think, here. Oh, okay. Thanks, Daniel. Yeah.
For everyone, I guess Daniel had just said varying levels of disciplinary action are threatened for employee violators of tobacco-free policy here. So it is institution. Varying levels of disciplinary action are threatened for, okay. Most extreme is termination for visitors. Ambassadors will politely ask them not to smoke. And that's at the University of Kentucky.
Okay.
I
I guess
think I
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to add for the University of Tennessee, where I happen to be, we do have a tobacco-free policy as well, and it does not allow vaping, but the enforcement is nebulous for us of who can do it.
And Matt just typed something here too. What about, I have no idea how common it is in the residence halls, thinking of issues with roommates. And I was going to actually throw that out to the group. I mean, how do we deal with the students in the residence halls? I mean, I know you can have policies, but how do we enforce that? I think is something to really think about. Oh, I see something in the Q&A. What are some ways that you would avoid secondhand smoke if there's someone in the household who smokes? I think I would suggest, making use of the ventilation, making sure that you're venting the emissions well and outside, or even just vaping outside if that's something the person is open to. Go ahead, James. I'm sorry. I can't tell if you're typing or what's
Oh no, this is a different dialogue than I'm familiar with. There,
Oh, me too.
I'm just as the questions come up, I am clicking that we are answering them live and then clearing them as you've complete answering them.
Oh, I get
So
it.
it shifts
Okay.
over to the answered pile.
Excellent. Okay, thank you.
Forgive me, that's a new feature for me.
Me too. Oh, here Matt says it basically falls to the RAs or roommate complaints for the most part, I fear. Right, yeah. I'm hoping that this kind of data that we're coming out with can help give some, some support to the things that you're trying to do on your campuses.
And Sarah had added, thank you for your presentation. 70% exhalation of particulate is useful to know. I suspect many think they are being considered by using a vape. Oh, probably consider it. maybe, but clearly there is still secondhand exposure.
Absolutely, Sarah.
And
That is a common misconception.
a new question. I don't have enough. I don't have knowledge of enforcement actions on our campus on a frequent basis, but I do know of a student in an engineering design lab who didn't comply with a request to stop vaping in a lab. He lost his access to work on his projects in the lab. That will be a major inconvenience to him completing his course.
Right. So that's great, Sean. Thank you. So another good suggestion.
Back in the chat, definitely the data is helpful. And traditional smoking involves inhalation of some radioactive materials. I expect no possibility of that in ends. So do we know of radioactive materials?
We do not, not in our work. We have not looked into any of that.
Have a little less than a minute remaining.
Okay.
Any additional questions? Here's one. What do you think about the Netflix doc Big Vape, Rise and Fall of Juul? Or the rise of, I'm sorry, Big Vape, the rise and fall of Juul. Crazy that in their head they were trying to design a safer way to smoke.
I have to say that I avoided it. I haven't watched it yet. I did put it on my list because I feel like I should watch it, but I haven't watched it yet. So, yeah, I agree.
I think with that, unless there's one more question, perhaps.
Thank you again for having us here. And I just really appreciate the opportunity to share this with you and be here. And I just wanted to say happy holidays to everybody. See you in the new year.
All right. Thank you very much, Christy. We do appreciate you coming to do this with us, and we hope to see you again in the future.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you, everyone.